I've never been afraid of ghosts or demons, witches or zombies. I get a kick out of these movies, but they never make me uncomfortable. What scares me are people. And I'm not talking about movie serial killers or wayward slashers. After all, there's always an origin story or trauma to explain away their behaviour. What I'm talking about is how little it takes to push people over the edge. How little it could take to bring this whole facade crumbling down. What I find really scary is the sense that there's something wrong with us. That somewhere in our collective psyche there's some essential flaw or an innate bestiality that we'll never get past.
Hi.
In Fright, known as Outback in some countries, exists at the fringes of what most mainstream film fans consider to be horror. It doesn't feature any jump scares, little blood and no obvious antagonist to try and outrun. But what it does share with most horror films is a deep and constant anxiety. This time about the very sociology and psychology of modern man. The film follows a reluctant outback school teacher named John Grant as he attempts to find his way home to Sydney during the Christmas holidays. His journey necessitates a one-night stopover in a small town named Bundan Yabba, known fondly as the Yabba to its locals. Over the course of the film, John finds himself trapped there, through his own fault, and later through frequent and sustained alcohol abuse. The film charters a civilised and modern man placed in a timelessly raw Australian outback. It's probably this setting that draws frequent parallels with two other notorious 70s films, Straw Dogs and Deliverance. Though the comparison is not without merit, there are some pretty vast differences and a single key element that, in my opinion, completely sets In Fright apart. Both Straw Dogs, which was released in the same year as In Fright, and Deliverance make the setting the antagonist and its residents an extension of it. These residents are openly hostile and ready to utilise violence against the film's protagonists. In contrast, the Yabba community may well be carousing, but it's also generous and bonhomie. In fact, this is one of the only forms of violence directly enacted on John, a kind of forceful hospitality. Hoffman's isolation from the community he is tortured by is the sole tension of Straw Dogs. But John Grant is welcomed by the residents we see, and is only separated from the Yabba by degrees. Indeed, it is clear that he is at ease in these communities, whether dealing with the rough nature of his landlord or his self-assured conduct in the bar or gambling room. Throughout the film, rather than being isolated in the Yabba, the problem is that he's caught between two intricately connected worlds. His career led him to the outback. He calls himself
bonded slave of the education department.
It's Grant's education that got him here, and it's worth noting that this policy that John Grant is a slave to has obviously been implemented to make sure more remote areas of the country do not fall behind in education or fall further back into lawlessness. We've seen this before. Fitzcarraldo, The Mission, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, even Dangerous Minds. Stories where lead characters try to change their surroundings, and the tension exists in the fear that they will be subsumed by it. However, we're given no indication in the text of the film that the teacher cares to change anything other than his own circumstances. In fact, this very eagerness to shirk his responsibility is what initially brings him down. This struggle at the centre of the film is within Grant, and goes a long way to explaining some of the decisions he makes which to the casual eye may seem like self-destruction. He is an educator, presumably charged with making students more like himself, more progressive, more ambitious, and yet it does not take long for him to adhere to another set of priorities. If it does look like self-destruction, it is because for a man like John Grant, hurting one element of his life sates the other. The Yabba, which every local honestly seems to love, is presented as a typical benighted outback town. It is important that this is not a bad place. People love it. There's fun, and Jock Crawford claims there is almost no crime. Though the sections of the community we see may be indecorous, there are few things that could be openly condemned. Though its atmosphere is rife with enmity, there are few events we could point to that highlight a barbarous nature. For that reason, this is a town where John Grant easily could have spent the night and got his flight the next morning. The town barely reacts to John's arrival. Just see how few people care when he enters the bar. Instead of the community reacting to John's arrival, the town reflects and sparks something in John, forcing a transmutation. The pivotal point in the movie, the inciting incident, comes in the form of the typically Australian gambling game of 2-up. A simple game of heads and tails where participants bet on 2 coins. The game is simple, and though the crowd is boisterous, they play fair. John, spurred on by success and a chance to escape his life as a small-time teacher, gambles and loses everything. It's a potent image. The 2 coins which placed over the eyes are said to be the ferryman's fee to the land of the dead, move John Grant forward into outback society, from observer to participant. The failure of the coins, heads or tails, illustrates the binary that society has set for itself, the past or the future, progressive or regressive. In trying to escape one part of himself, that of the bonded teacher, John Grant begins his journey to another. Part of this binary is addressed through the film via the proxy of education. It's not exactly overt, but the theme of education works as a kind of thematic framing device. This is not only true due to protagonist John Grant, but also in the crucial character of Doc Tyden, played by the legendary Donald Pleasance. Doc Tyden is a man of keen intellect who has given himself over completely to the heady lifestyle of the yabber. He is, of course, an alcoholic, but it is never clear if he needs the alcohol to remain content with his descended lifestyle, or if it is the alcohol that brought him to the yabber where he felt content as an alcoholic. In The Doctor there is something of a contradiction about our view of education. Seen as the one most enriching tool we can offer humanity, and yet here the Doctor has fallen into complete squalor. But even as a drunk, he is a valued member of society. People still come to him as a doctor, and the community allows him to live cash-free. Doc is a likely possible outcome for John Grant, and a lot of the film revolves around the kinetic energy of their relationship. There's often the sense that Doc is only talking to Grant, even when there's other people in the room. Alcohol is presented here as the gateway to our other self, and as an old fortune cookie once said, a drunk man's words are a sober man's thoughts. The cultural significance attributed to alcohol is clear throughout the film. It's almost omnipresent and presented as ubiquitous for the Australian man. Alcohol's most important factor is that it releases inhibition. In Grant, this pushes him into a near frenzied state which he drinks to maintain. The outback man inside him comes to dominance, and though he may not compare to the true yabba men such as Dick and Joe, the change is believable and disturbingly fast. John Grant, for all his books, is a bacchanal like the rest of them. If the director is highlighting a section of Australian culture, he is sure to show that it is a potential part of the whole Australian consciousness, not just backwards country folk. The argument is that this kind of behaviour is autochthonous to the Australian identity. Early in the film, John Grant is on the train, leaving the town, where he is forced to teach and he daydreams about his future holiday. He does not see himself at concerts or surrounded by high-minded intellectuals. Instead, he rubs down the cleavage of an attractive woman with a beer in his hand. The cultural significance of alcohol is addressed directly when Grant attempts to flee the town, and on invitation for a drink, he responds.
What's wrong with you? What's the matter with you people, huh? You sponge on you burn your house down, murder your wife, rape your child, that's all right. Not have a drink with you, not have a flaming bloody drink with you, that's a criminal offence, that's the end of the bloody world.
This statement is particularly potent considering 2 events that had just taken place in the story's narrative. The first may be the film's most notorious scene, a grisly animal hunt which took place in reality when director Todd Kotcheff and his crew followed a group of hunters out into the bush and filmed the organised slaughter of dozens of kangaroos. In the narrative, this slaughter is performed by local dude bros Dick and Joe, with John Grant and Doc Tyden as willing participants. As they drive through the bush and take pot shots and finally finish the animals off with knives, there's a strange mania to it. Strange because it makes a solidarity between the characters. Dick and Joe had never been unpleasant before this scene, but they'd made John, and through him, us the audience, wary. But throughout the scene, the characters are almost interchangeable, except perhaps for John's inexperience. Though John shows some passing moments of regret, they're fleeting, and far less potent than his moments of immense joy. The second moment comes immediately after the hunt and a drunken brawl. John and Doc Tyden return to his shack, and the implication, though it's never shown, is that Doc rapes John. This horrific act is, in a lot of ways, a logical conclusion to the second act. What else is John doing but trying to subjugate himself, to beat down and humiliate himself? If Doc really is the realization of what John could be, a rape is the perfect metaphor. These horrific events are all fueled by alcohol. John Grant uses alcohol to break through the perceived rules he has for society and himself. Though it leads to a massive amount of distress, we are shown shot after shot of John enjoying himself. The alcohol breaks him down to his most innate nature. The Yabba, on the other hand, is shown to have never progressed, never hidden itself under the lie of civilization. Again, Doc Tyden makes it clear that to him it is all an illusion. Temporarily calling Grant Socrates, he sums up the thesis of the film.
Perfectibility, progress, a vanity spawned by fear. A vanity spawned by fear.
This is what screenwriter Evan Jones may well have been trying to expose in the form of John Grant. The modernisation of Australia is just a cloak because inside every Australian is a Yabba man. Of course, pigeonholing a whole country like this is going to draw criticism. The message of the film, if accepted in this way, is certainly not a flattering one. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of this film is its claim for social realism. In the heat and the sweat, the naturalistic acting and John Grant's very candid transformation, Wake in Fright can feel more documentary than horror film. Australia's own reaction to it was understandably uncomfortable, but the general feeling is summed up in a now legendary tete-a-tete between a viewer and Jack Thompson, who played the thug Dick. During a screening, the viewer is said to have stood up and, pointing to the screen, shouted, "That's not us," to which Thompson coolly responded, "Sit down, mate. It is us." The truth is that it would be impossible to separate Wake in Fright from its setting. This is an Australian film, about Australia, but that doesn't mean its message isn't universal. In philosophy, in politics, in sociology, on the left and the right, there's always been a question surrounding civilization. At what point did we become civilized? What factors changed that separated us from our other barbarous state? What's stopping us from going back? The fact is that any section of society put under such artful scrutiny is going to come out badly. Director Kochev builds up a heady canvas of sunlight and dust that has you squinting through the screen. It's disturbing and incredibly distressing, but it never seems fantastical. To identify that the Australian consciousness is full of such horrors is not to single them out, but to admire the perceptiveness of all involved in making this film and the insights of the book it came from. The events depicted here may have been fictitious, but as I'm sure Jack Thompson would tell you, this world really existed. The power of the film is in its exploration, not its condemnation. The point may be that John Grant is the truest malefactor of this piece because he knows better. He is the only liar, the rest are just following their nature. Much more likely is that this film, as a social comment rather than an art form, is just one layer of identification, to look at what a man can be, as well as what he is and was. To me, the film states clearly that the educated man who doesn't know himself is no better, if not worse, than an uneducated man who doesn't know how to move forward. The key seems to be in a worldly education, past that of an ordinary teacher. It is no less than Pythagoras who said, "No one is free who has not obtained the empire of himself. No man is free who cannot command himself."